So welcome to the Joanne Avison podcast and welcome Professor Darrell Evans.
Hi there, Joan.
Hi, Darrell. So thrilled to have you with me. And I've known you, it feels like decades, but I do remember when I first met you, I think we were both presenting to a group of osteopaths.
That's right.
And you were doing a presentation called Scanning for Gold, talking about how to use MRI scanning to get gold medals. And we struck up an interest, and it's been a fascinating learning curve for me ever since. So just a great big huge thank you.
No, it's been a wonderful journey. Yeah, love chatting to you about so many different subjects.
Well, I remember at the time, I think you were Associate Dean at Brighton and Sussex Medical School.
That's right.
And I remember barging into your office one day and saying, why do you call it the musculoskeletal system when it's got to have fascia involved in it, and it's actually a osteomyofascial system, at least, if not a neuro-osteomyofascial system? And I remember your answer to me was, because my students have to qualify in musculoskeletal anatomy, because you were Associate Dean of the Anatomy School as well. So I just wondered if you would share with us some of your career, how you became fascinated in biology, embryology, developmental biology, I know is your professorship, and how we got to connective tissue, because it's actually one of your research papers I quoted in my first book, I think. And in that paper you mentioned is connective tissue, the hidden player behind muscular development in the embryo of everything. So on that note, tell me how you began your fascination, and then I'm going to ask you about connective tissue. I'm going to drive you mad.
No worries. No, I love being driven mad by you and all your lovely questions. It's always a joy. I suppose I've had a bit of an unconventional career, really, in terms of I'm one of those typical people who never knew what I wanted to do. I knew I loved biology. I was very, very lucky to grow up in an area of Kent where we had a woodland behind us, about 500-acre woodland. So I loved exploring, making camps out there, watching nature, all those things you do when you're growing up. But I suppose never thought that would probably be a career for me. But then I suppose I really enjoyed reading, and I enjoyed reading the stories of Prof Darrell and My Family and Other Animals, particularly. And again, whilst I loved the family interaction piece, I also adored his fascination with biology and animals and plants and the joy he got from that. And I think that just struck a bit of a chord with me. But then there was another, I suppose, moment growing up, and that was that I used to watch what were called the Royal Institution Christmas lectures. I think were on the BBC at the time. They were started in about 1830, something like that, with Michael Faraday. And basically, you tried to get members of the public interested in science. And they got these wonderful speakers that would really bring alive different parts of science. And I just remember one in particular, a guy called Lewis Wolpert, who is a very famous developmental biologist. And he was really intriguing the way he brought kids down out of the audience and really got them entertained in this whole new world for me. And I never thought that developmental biology was going to be my thing either, but I loved what he was doing. I thought, God, wouldn't it be great to be able to do sort of that and to get people interested in a subject? Didn't think much more about that, and then decided, what degree was I going to do at university? Because I knew I wanted to study something. And so I took a degree in biomedical sciences, which basically is the jack of all trades, master of none. So in other words, you've got to study lots of different things: immunology, microbiology, anatomy, physiology, lots of different subjects. And I was intrigued by a lot of them, but anatomy, I think, was the one that really sort of interested me. And I was lucky enough to be offered a PhD in Aberdeen in Scotland in the anatomy department to study muscle development. And I thought, this would be really interesting to do. And it was a PhD that was sponsored by the Anatomical Society. And because of that, it meant I got to go to various conferences and present on my work, and opened up that whole new world of networking with other scientists and learning lots from them and getting excited. And I was really lucky at the end of my PhD to have a trip to America as one of those conferences. And I was presenting my poster, as you do, with my research findings. And next to me was another poster looking at development of muscle in the head. And I got speaking to the presenters of that poster and was really intrigued by the work that they were doing. And I thought, gosh, would it be good to do research in America? where it's really well funded. It's a sort of a different world, really fantastic universities over there. And I was at the conference dinner. There's always a conference dinner towards the end. And they happened to sit next to us in a group. My girlfriend at the time, who's been my wife, so over 25 years now, she was not backwards and coming forwards. And she straight out asked Drew Noden, who was this embryologist who is very, very well-renowned figure, so how did you get a postdoc in America then? And so he turned to me.
God bless Avison.
No. So he turned to me and he went, so are you really interested in doing some work out here? And I said, yeah, it'd be really, really, really good. And he said, well, when you get back to the UK, he said, think about it a little bit more, look up some of my papers, and then get in contact again. So that's exactly what I did. And I wrote him a letter that had to be faxed because it was prior to email and old-fashioned times.
What year are we in, Darrell, at this point?
So we would be in 1994, 93, 94. And so it's a backwards and forwards in faxing. And he offered me a 3-year position over there, which was wonderful. And he was at Cornell University, one of the Ivy League universities that's in Ithaca, New York State. So I had a wonderful time over there and really learned loads about embryology. He was a fascination, and he has a wonderful lineage because he did his PhD, and that goes right the way back to Spaemann, one of the famous German embryologists. And it was just really intriguing to hear about all these stories about how they really explored the ideas of embryology and thought about it in a very, very different way. And I think one thing I have learned is that we've lost so much of what they knew that they never published, or they published in obscure journals that no one ever goes back to. So I think there's some real intriguing answers to some problems still out there, probably written down possibly somewhere, which I think is fantastic to think about. But how do we get hold of that information? So from there, I got a lectureship back in the UK at Cardiff University, and I opened up my own lab. Again, still working on muscle development, but starting to explore into connective tissues, cartilage, a little bit of bone, but not so much. And was starting to be really intrigued about the interaction and that spatial organization and how that happens during development. And thinking about, well, if something goes wrong, how might we think about correcting that? What would be the players? Which would be the leaders? Which would be the followers in that area? And then I was really lucky enough to go to Brighton and Sussex Medical School when it first opened. It was a brand new medical school, helping Di Lawrence Watt, the Prof of Anatomy at the time, design the curriculum. And it was a real fun time. And I gradually worked up the ladder to become a professor and head of anatomy at the time, associate dean, and then I met you. But
and please don't anyone think that I had anything to do with your qualifications, but I know I was just so intrigued by what you were doing, and I was so frankly excited to be talking to a professor of anatomy, that you had this incredible ability to explain things so that people understood. And you even invited me to one of your first year medical student lectures, which was a complete eye-opener for me. But I want to just take to the next level the fact that you fell in love with teaching and learning as a process. So I know you were constantly guided by and committed deeply to embryology and muscle development, and the dissection lab that I've spent many hours in Brighton and Sussex Medical School lab working with prosection, as well as obviously the dissection experience I've had. And I just remember how important the emphasis that you put on teaching and learning. Did that start at Cardiff?
Yeah, I think it really started at Cardiff, because that was the time when I was able to take over modules and run them myself for the first time. And I remember going to lectures by others, and whilst they were full of fantastically interesting information, not always really, I think, delivered to the audience level. These were dental students. They didn't need to know the nth degree of embryology, but they needed to be excited by embryology, to think about particularly the craniofacial abnormalities that they were going to come across, and not be frightened by that, be knowledgeable about that to the right degree, so that they can obviously deal with their patients appropriately. And I think that just gave me intriguing thoughts into, well, how can I do this sort of differently? How can I stimulate them differently? So I basically completely unpacked the embryology, started from scratch, said, right, here are the building blocks. Let's work our way up. Let's take away all the information you don't need to know, and let's focus on the things that you really do need to know, but do it in a refreshing way. So a bit more interactions in lectures. I'm doing some practical classes. I designed a very early website, no longer around, but it was fun at the time to put quizzes together and all those sorts of things to really sort of help the students. And then moving to Brighton and Sussex, it gave us a real opportunity to do things differently. And Di Lawrence Watt was as stimulated by learning and teaching as I was. So it was somebody wonderful to work with. And that just gave you that extra impetus to say, yeah, we really can strive for something different. And anatomy at BSMS became the unique selling point of the university, most definitely.
Oh, I'm not surprised. I mean, and you know, my personal experience, I'll never forget when I put together a lecture and you said, well, why don't you come and present it? And I'm standing there with you and my son, Ben, who worked with you and you worked with him. He did his master's in sports and exercise science. And I think no small thanks to you having a day in the lab with him and giving him a reference. He became a swim coach. And just, it was your warmth and your lack of superiority. And I remember standing there in that lab and I was terrified. I was absolutely terrified. I'd never stood, not in a lab, I remember standing in the lecture theatre. It's all beautifully tiered and open. And I went to pieces. I just went to pieces. And you said, I think this might be the Darrell effect, and just completely forgave me and gave me all these keys. And it changed the way I teach for sure, very, very quickly. Not out of fear, but just out of the warmth and the specific ladder that you gave me in which to make things engaging and greet your audience, care about your audience. And it's one of my bugbears with when I'm teaching structural work or movement, that it's all very well I demonstrate to you that I know my anatomy by using all these long words. But the truth is, you don't know what I'm talking about, and your clients aren't going to know what you're talking about. So let's know what they do, what they are, and use these languages of convenience in order to express them. And I think you've done that at such a profound level. And I know your students absolutely adored you at BSMS because I met so many of them.
Well, I just really love the way to think about that. We're all learners. So I don't like this superiority approach to thing. We're all learning all the time. And we just happen to know something a little bit more in one area and somebody else is going to know something in another area. But I always thought that word teacher, whilst I think it's a lovely word, I think I felt myself much more as a facilitator of learning and trying to be enabling to people to get excited about what they do. Learning is fun, or it should be. And if it's not fun, then perhaps we're doing it the wrong way and you need to think about it differently. And so I think the students responded to that appropriately. But one thing I was really passionate about was getting them to be teachers as well, getting them to do it. So I did a lot of work in near peer teaching. So getting our third year and our fourth year students to teach our first and second year students, because they're, particularly as they're medical students, they're going to be teaching for the rest of their lives. They're going to be teaching within their teams. They're going to be leading teams. And it's really important, I think, that they develop that skill. So I used to get them into the dissecting room to teach anatomy to first years if they were a fourth year. And then I progressed into doing that in physiology and other areas as well. And I think the students really got a lot from that. We were able to publish some work in that to demonstrate what the great outcomes were. So I think that whole passion around learning and teaching sort of came from that. And then I remember getting a phone call one day from Australia, and it was at one of these headhunting agencies. And you never know how they quite got hold of your name. And I remember them in saying, we've heard about the things that you're doing at Brighton and Sussex Medical School in the UK. And I was, okay. He said, we've actually got a position here. We wondered whether you'd be interested in it. We'd be teaching on a slightly bigger scale. So sort of how many students do you have at Brighton and Sussex? And I said, well, all told, probably 1,200 to 1,500, something like that, depending on which of the students you counted. He said, okay, so the university I'm talking about is Monash University in Victoria in Australia. He said, we have 75,000 students there. And it was like, oh, that's quite a few more. And it was the position, but it was called Pro Vice Chancellor Learning and Teaching. But basically what that meant is you overlooked the whole of the strategy for learning and teaching at the university. So it doesn't matter whether students were in engineering or in the arts or in law or in medicine or science. I was responsible for looking at the strategy and therefore how we would teach going forward, and trying to move away from a very didactic approach to teaching to a much more inclusive, interactive, collaborative sort of approach. And I designed a strategy called Better Teaching, Better Learning, and had great fun working with some wonderful colleagues over there to try and transform learning and teaching. And so whilst I had to lose my anatomy as the focus of what I did, I still got an opportunity to do a couple of little lectures here and there. And I stayed there for about 5 years. And then I moved up to the University of Newcastle, about 2 hours north of Sydney. And I became what they call the Deputy Vice Chancellor Academic there. And that was really overseeing all academic areas, including learning and teaching, but wider still. I really enjoyed working there and making hopefully some differences. But then I got a little bit fed up with all the administration, the management, took me away from being creative. And that frightened me a bit. I remember my wife seeing me, I don't know, not in mental distress quite, but certainly very, very down and depressed about things. And that spark, she said, had gone. And I thought, well, this is a telltale sign that I need to sort of move and do something else. So I broke out of that and set up my own little consulting business, and now go around to different universities and non-for-profit organizations and talk about strategy and learning and teaching and all those things, and have much more fun time, because I actually control my own diary again, which is wonderful, and choose which jobs I want to do and which ones I don't want to. And you get to meet some wonderful people that are sort of really stimulating in all different areas of learning and teaching, but also still of science and anatomy. So I suppose hopefully that's not too a longer journey, but that's, I suppose, my journey up to now.
Well, I just love it, because there's so much in there. There's this richness of the embryo, which we'll talk about in a minute with that famous paper that you've written. And I'm sure there's more than one, but the whole process of becoming so passionate about the process of how we learn. And of course, I'm intrigued about the hidden treasure in the history of embryology, because that just fascinates me, but we'll unpack that. What I wanted to ask you next was about that paper that I quoted in my book, Yoga, Fascia, Anatomy and Movement. And, we worked together, you became a client. And I was able to, once I got over my fear of actually treating somebody who definitely knows more about anatomy than I'm ever going to learn. I remember being completely petrified. Oh my God, I've got a professor of anatomy coming into my studio. Is he going to test me? And I just remember how easily and graciously we worked together, which is absolutely thanks to your whole manner. And I knew when you left Brighton and Sussex Medical School, I got to see some of the responses from some of your students, and I think that picture on the wall behind you is from one of them, isn't it, where they turned the arterial system into a fun learning diagram based on the London tube map.
Absolutely
brilliant. I know, and it's fascinating. I remember when you left, you gifted me an embryo model like the one also on the shelf behind you, which is another precious thing that I take with me and put on shelves wherever I'm going and when I'm teaching. And I remember saying to you, when I'd written Yoga, Fascia, and Anatomy and Movement, and you rigorously went through that chapter, and some things I remember you writing to me, Joe, you can't say this. You can't make up words. This is just no. And you were so brilliant. And then you said to me, you can have this word. And the word you let me have was spatialization as well as specialization. I remember you saying that. And that is so important, because obviously my work's entirely based on spatial organization of the form, how it encompasses space and how it moves through space. And it's not it's an individual, and it's always got such a profound archetypal pattern. But so one of the papers I quoted, and obviously got very intrigued and fascinated by, is skeletal muscle translocation in vertebrates. I'll put a link to that paper underneath, and it was a paragraph called "Is Connective Tissue the Forgotten Player?" What gave you that interest in fascia, basically?
You'll know more than anybody else the way people, especially in anatomy, I think, have dismissed fascia. It's that tissue that they pick off into sections to make everything else look pretty, and you can see all the muscle. And so many people have done that, but so many people have not really thought about fascia, I think, or connective tissues in more of an in-depth way, to think about, well, how the hell do they come together to form this network that surrounds everything? this big continuous tissue from head to toe, and people have forgotten about it. It's like I started to go, why have I forgotten about it? Why am I not thinking about this in a different way? Why have I compartmentalized it completely? And whilst I still would talk about the epimecium and the endomecium around muscles, it's been compartmentalized to saying it's just one little band of connective tissue around that particular muscle or around that particular muscle, whereas actually this is a continuing intricate network that's all connected in different ways. That's why it's called connective tissue, for goodness sake. And I think it was also lost in the way we think about it in the embryo. The embryo is very much thinks about connective tissue cells, but they think about them being, I suppose, the most proliferant cell type in the embryo. But then people then focus in on the muscle progenitors. They focus in on cartilage. They focus in on bone or other tissue types they're interested in. And again, the connective tissue sort of gets an after mention or a side thought within that. And I started to become much more interested in terms of, well, who's the player here? Do muscle really know what they're doing, or does the connective tissue really know what it's doing, in terms of they have to end up both at the same site? And in the embryo, they come from different places. So the muscle cells, particularly for our limbs, come from things called somites, which are blocks of tissue that sit either side of the developing spinal cord. And those cells basically move out and move into the limb and populate to become the muscles that we know of our forelimbs and our hind limbs. But actually, the connective tissue has to get in there as well. And the connective tissue comes from the lateral plate mesoderm, so much more further laterally. So it actually enters first into the limb with the muscles coming behind. And a colleague of mine, Gabrielle Cardon, did an experiment where basically she stopped the muscle progenitors coming into the limb and said, does the connective tissue still go in? And does it still pattern, or does it still have this sort of organization to it? And indeed, those cells went in and they pattern irrespective of the myogenic cells being there. So they know something. They have a history. They have a determinant of knowing where to be. And that's all controlled, obviously, by molecular mechanisms and organization. But there's more than that as well. I think it's about the interactions that cells have on one another. And they remember some of that. And they have to interact to get to the place that they're going to, because they have to move. Not only is the embryo growing, but they're having to move across boundaries in different sort of ways. So that, I think, was the element why I wrote that bit in the chapter, that we can talk about muscle. And I'm still intrigued about how muscle develops. And even from when I go down the gym and thinking, gosh, what are my muscles doing now? And how are they reacting to the stresses and strains that I'm putting on them? But it's that thing of saying, yeah, but if the connective tissues weren't there, they'd be doing nothing. And so the connective tissues are all important. So you couldn't write a paper, I didn't think, on the embryology of muscle development without mentioning what I thought was then the forgotten player of connective tissue. And a similar thing happens in the head as well. It's a little bit more complex because connective tissue comes from a couple of different sources. And it's obviously, when we think about the head and the face, it's a much more sort of complicated, complex structure that's there. So there's a lot more things that are happening in terms of the cells interacting with one another. So I suppose that's where the sort of the interest came. And then I was taught the joys of fascia by a certain Joe Avison, and learned a tremendous amount more. And I think that made me be challenged appropriately. I love to be challenged about things. Otherwise, things become doctrine, and that's the way we are. We don't question them. And I think that's a failing by some scientists, that we're not as open as we should be. And if there's no direct evidence for it, don't rule it out. Think about how you might get that evidence, or better still, be the subject of someone like you, as I was, going, well, you have changed how I move or how I feel. And therefore, that to me is evidence that something's happening and something's changing. And we might not understand all the science behind that, although you certainly do, and Paul, in your wonderful courses and webinars that you do. I don't think we necessarily know all the ins and outs of that. And I think that's an intriguing element, because I think there needs to be a huge amount more research in connective tissues and the way we think about them.
Well, wow. And thank you for all that you've just said. I mean, I remember, can I share about your
Yeah, cool.
music player? I remember the first time you came to see me as a client, and you were having difficulty jumping out of a swimming pool after you're swimming every day. You had to use the steps because you had a pain in your neck and the organization in your spine. And I remember body reading you, and I'll never forget as long as I live, because I was terrified. Because intellectually, I mean, you're just in a different league to anything I knew about then, and still now. I mean, no question. But I remember standing there thinking, "Oh my goodness, I can see an instrument," and it was like I was looking at a photograph of you where someone had somehow moved out a saxophone, but everything else was there. I can't explain. It could have been I didn't know exactly which instrument it was, but I just saw this musical stance and this music. I can't explain how I see that. As I understand it, I have a form of synesthesia, which is touch and hearing are mixed in me. So when I put my hands on someone, I can immediately sort of hear their tissue. I don't know what that's all about. It's driven me nuts, but it's also helped me hugely in the work I do. But I remember standing looking at you, and then you looked at me and you went, "Okay, doc, what's your verdict?" That's what you said. And I'm not a doctor, or I wasn't then. And I was like, well, I don't know how to say this to you, but did you play an instrument? And you went, "Yes." And I said, "What was it?" And you said, "The saxophone." And I said, "Did you play it as a teenager?" And you answered me, "Yes, for several years." And I said, "Okay, I'm really sorry, but you've got saxophonitis." Just remember you looking at me absolutely like nonplussed, and you shook your head slightly and you said, "Well, I have to say that's a new one on
Yeah.
me." I was like, "Oh my God, I've had it." He's literally going to walk out. He's going to get dressed and walk out. And you didn't, and you stayed. And a combination of that and Ben watching your swimming profile and how you actually moved in the water, which was so helpful to me, because he practically grew up in Tom Meyer's training room when I was a teacher for him. And so he could body read. I mean, he can body read. That's just a skill that he had at 9 years old. He didn't even know he had. And I just remember him saying, "Well, when Darrell turns to breathe, he does this, 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 and this." And it was like magic, because I was able to then bring that into the tissue through my hands, and we resolved so much. But what I love about what you're saying is that you allowed that personal experience to actually change how you move and then impact how you teach about connective tissue. And I'd love to get you with Paul at some point, because Paul says, "I don't know why it's called connective tissue, because it's never disconnected." Great comment. And I love to think of it as the tissue of relationship. I think fascia is a very important tissue. I think it animates. If spirit animates the being, which defines it as alive, right? Because spirit is present as missing in the cadaveric laboratory, because the anima animus of that body has gone. Yes, it's present as missing in the lab. Whether you're doing dissection or prosection, that all gone. Spirit all gone. It can't laugh, it can't breathe, it can't move. Blood doesn't pump through its veins. Everything is still and in a state of deterioration. It's waiting to return to the dust from which it came, as it is said. And what I am even more fascinated now with my spiritual science studies is this idea that the individual anima animus that animates these tissues, organizes them, has the power to change them and be changed by them, is what you harnessed and then allowed to kind of infiltrate your thinking at one level, and still do. And I absolutely love how you describe to me when you go to the gym and you have a different approach. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Like your teaching and learning in life is how you teach and learn with others. It's just incredible.
Look, I mean, the gym piece is really interesting to me, because I think, like anyone, early on, you just go to the gym and you pull weights and things. And I suddenly thought, gosh, but I actually know the anatomy here. I know actually what's happening. So it got me to very much more concentrate on what I was doing, the stance that I had, the type of weight, how fast, slow, and then really thinking about that muscle. So I think a lot of people go to the gym and just, well, I'm meant to pull that weight, aren't I? And I'm pulling that weight, and it's meant to be helping my bicep, isn't it? Or it's meant to be helping my deltoid, or whatever it happens to be. But I think it's different if you get a connection to thinking actually about that muscle or group of muscles, if it's a certain type of movement that you're making. I think that makes it a richer movement. I think you really think about it. I think you think about the stretch part of that more, the contractive phase, and much more. And it's really intriguing. Somebody at my local gym who hasn't got any background in science at all, and he's a typical Aussie tradie, and he and I chat quite a bit. And he talked to me about this himself, about he really thinks now about, not because of what I've said, his own practice is he thinks about how he stands much more. He thinks about the muscles or muscle that he's working at that point. And that to me is wonderful. That's a connection from somebody who's a scientist that's come to that, and somebody that doesn't have that background, but has thought about it appropriately. And I just think that we've got these wonderful bodies, and to be able to think about them during that phase, I think is really nice. And I still do within swimming, although sometimes early morning, perhaps I'm not quite there in terms of thinking intellectually about it, but I certainly know my muscles are working at that stage. So I think that's probably the intriguing thing. And then some of the things that you talked about, to me, it's because I think the embryos taught me that as well. I think the embryo is so fascinating. And I think it's so fascinating that so many of us are here because of how complex the developmental journey is to have got us all to this point. And I recognize that some people have disabilities and they do really very, very well with a changed piece of anatomy. But actually, we've all got little bits of anatomy that are not quite right. We may never know that we've got those. We may leave this mortal coil never knowing that something was wrong. But we've all got some developmental abnormality in some shape or form. But I think that's to think of that in awe and wonder that actually we've got to that stage, because there are so many, as I say, mechanisms, complex interactions that go right to produce us what we are. And I remember watching one video, and I think it's something Paul said about, it might have been yourself, Joe, that the beauty is that we are different on both sides. And I come at it from two different angles on that. I think it is that the beauty is that we're different on both sides. But I also think isn't it amazing that we're almost the same on both sides? The embryo enabled that basically you've got two programs running at the same time, and that you've produced what you've produced. And sometimes, obviously, there's only one liver, only one heart, and things like that. But when you think about the limbs and the outgrowth that we've got of our limbs, and it's virtually the same, bar a few millimeters here and there. But I think that's just absolutely fascinating. And I think the thing that we've lost, I think you bring certainly to the picture, is that whole element of history, of that. If you reawaken, I'll call it the fascia, it remembers actually what it's meant to do and what it's meant to be and how it's meant to envelop, how it's meant to go back to its spiral action or whatever it happens to be. And that strikes a chord with me so well, because that's how I've always thought about that. I think many of our cells in our body have a history to them, and it's about remembering that. And even I remember in my professorial lecture at BSMS, when you become a professor, you normally have to give a lecture on your work. And I talked about journeys, and I'd gone all the way around the country, but I was born in Kent and I ended up in Sussex. But it didn't mean that I'd only moved from Kent to Sussex. I'd gone to Aberdeen, I'd gone to America, I'd gone to Cardiff. So I'd gone on all this journey. And I think, and I've obviously remembered, and that's taught me loads of things, but the cell is the same thing. It may end up in a fairly same locations it almost started, but it may have gone all the way around the houses to actually get to that point again. So it's undergone so many interactions. It's going to learn. And I think we underestimate sometimes how much our cells and how much our tissues have learned, and therefore have a history to them.
I love that. And I think that it also takes you naturally into a sort of a spiritual thing that we carry. We talk about karma, and sometimes you carry your history, and can you release yourself from it? And that journey is that possible? Because I often have people in my courses asking questions about, well, I've been really careful to do this, this, and this as a cause. Therefore, why am I experiencing this, this, and this, arthritis in a knee, or why did I need a hip replacement when I've done such good yoga for so many years? Questions like that. And I think that it's a little bit about us being so zealous about isolating individual areas, about stretching joints, which I can't even tell you how upset I get when people wait for the muscle creep and stretch longer and ask me if please, would you help me do the splits better so that I can be a better yoga teacher? No. That's not so you can be a better yoga teacher. That's so that you can actually damage the historical patterning of your joint that actually needs the spring loading inside it absolutely maintained so that you can walk. And you're going to pull on that because it knows what it's supposed to do. And you're literally violating what I think is the embryological code by overstretching, by overcompressing, by doing too much, and by focusing on, as you said, I want big delta. I've seen tralis major muscle pop off the shoulder when there's just too much, or the quads, where there's just too much. The muscle gaster has become volumetrically too big for the connective tissue attachments, if you want to call them that, to the bones. The continuity is literally disorganized by shape. And I think morphology is archetypal. And if you can find archetypal congruency between who you are, how you move, where you move, and it's congruent with your history as a human being, that's from embryo to elder, I think magic happens, because you just be who you are, and you move the way who you are moves, and you express that, and it all becomes congruent.
Yeah.
Because I like to think of fascia as a tissue of relationship. And I think what you're talking about, if I can say so, is the relationship you have with your history, yourself, and your life, and your own journey.
Yeah, and I think it's remembering that we have a real gift in our bodies, and therefore, if we don't look after them and we don't treat them with appropriate respect, they're not going to treat you with respect back, because we've pushed them in the wrong direction. And look, part of it's selfish. I want to be, as I get older, I want to still be active. I still want to be doing things appropriately. And I do look at the science of what happens in old age, and therefore I know what I'm meant to do to make sure my muscles are still stimulating, that I get good grip strength and all these sorts of things. But I have that added thing now of having worked with you, having looked at a lot of the work that you and Paul have done. I understand more about those other things that I'm meant to do, that then become enable, I suppose, to be a much more holistic approach to thinking about anatomy. So I've gone through, I suppose, from being an anatomist in terms of a facilitator of learning of anatomy, to somebody who thinks much more about their own anatomy and the beauty of that holistic element of all those things coming together for my own well-being and those around me. But I still get very upset when I go to the gym and I see people doing the things that they do in the gym, or personal trainers showing people how to do things. And I'm going, yeah, but does their anatomy allow them to do that? Because not all anatomy does. As Joe knows, I've got a very weird back, and therefore I can't do certain things. I can't breathe out of both sides when I'm swimming, no matter how hard I try it to do that. So I think forcing people to do those things. I think what you do is very different. You're allowing things to almost go back to a reset position. That then, does that enable you to do things? If it doesn't enable you to do things, well, you know that that's where your limitations are. And you mentioned right at the start about when we first met, and I was doing a presentation on what was called scanning for gold. And one of the reasons for doing that project, obviously, it's because it was the Olympics and I'm coming up in London. Right. But it was to say, actually, are all athletes capable of being the best athletes, the top athletes, the gold medal winner? And what I was trying to say was, actually, no, because of genetics, because of the way we've dealt with our bodies, lots of different things, because of the embryo and all the processes in there, we might not be able to be fantastic at that particular sport. And maybe we should have chosen another sport that we would have been absolutely fantastic at. And it was that ability to think, well, can we use MRI and scanning to look at the body and to say, well, why are these particular people really good at what they do? And we were able to study and look at those sorts of things. But it comes back to, again, not everyone's anatomy will allow them to do the things that they think that they should do just because they see somebody else doing it. And it's, don't be jealous of that. Don't make your goal in life to get like that. If you can get there, that's fantastic. But many of us won't be able to do that.
I love that. And this is why the work that we do is so personal profile driven, not practical protocol driven. So when you're focused on, your protocols, your techniques, you have them like a toolbox, and you look at that person and you literally learn. And it's not hard to learn. It's just very focused on how to use the tools according to the profile you're working with. And I love that, because I think we share that your teaching and learning process is all about distinguishing where there's symmetry, where there's asymmetry, and rather than making it wrong, making it the useful lantern to light the way that's congruent for that person. Yeah. And I think if we can own that for ourselves, we actually can literally forgive ourselves for not being able to do that like that, and find the way to do it like this. I'm not saying there isn't an appropriate way to do things and everybody's just freelance. That doesn't work either. It's as you say, it's scanning for the gold in us.
Yeah.
Physiologically and profile driven. So that's I think our motive. And I thank you for that generous endorsement, because it's a lonely road, Darrell.
Yeah, I can absolutely see that it is. Now, look, part of the problem is anatomists, actually.
Why?
Well, because anatomists have very much classified, categorized, named things, become very fixed on the sort of learning of anatomy as it is. Some people do think functionally, but some people think about functionality in an isolated way. So I know you hate the term levers when you're thinking about...
I don't hate them. There aren't any. My father was a mechanical engineer, and the definition of a lever is an open 2-bar chain with a pin joint. And there's no open 2-bar chains in human bodies anywhere.
But anatomists have needed to categorize, to classify, to name things appropriately. And even within fascia, people name things, as you know, even obviously the layers around muscles, but then people also talk about fashion regional ways, because anatomy has often been taught in a regional manner. There's no wrong way necessarily of teaching anatomy, but it's enabling people to think that actually this is all connected in some shape or form, and that everything influences something else. Because in the embryo, that's what was happening. And it all started out with one cell at the end of the day. So we've all come from that one cell joining with another cell, fusing together, and suddenly we've got magic happening in the embryo. And I think we haven't lost it necessarily in anatomy, but because the way that then we assess anatomy is often in a very didactic approach as well. Name that bone. What are the attachment sites? Which muscle joins to that one? Whereas we have much more started to in the last decade or so, tested students much more in a functional way. A boy's riding his bike and he falls over, he's taken to the hospital. Okay, what tests would you do? And use the anatomy to explain why you're doing those tests to see what might be wrong with that child. That way I get to really understand whether they really know the anatomy, what's joining together, what influences different elements, rather than naming the bones in the arm and the muscles that are attached to them. And it's like, I don't see the sense in that. What is that? I happen to know all 650 odd muscles in the body, or 204 bones in the body. However, not everyone has 204 bones, and not everyone has 650 odd muscles in their body. No. So we've again brought it into, this is what you learn, rather than allowing people to think about that in a little bit more of, I suppose, a functional, individual way. And so anatomical variation to me is so critical. I think it is in your world because you understand it. We were talking about
Yes.
body reading
my
and all
goodness.
those sorts of things. I
Totally.
mentioned it in terms of sort of everyone's different and therefore you can't push certain people in certain directions. But we all look different on the outside. And I always say to people, you all look different on the inside as well. Yes, you may all have a liver and a heart, and they might all be roughly in the same locations, etc., etc. But actually, there's intricacies there. There's things that are different. There's extra blood vessels. There's extra nerve trails. There's extra bellies of muscles that we didn't know about, or less muscle bellies than you thought about. Has someone got a defined this versus a defined that? They've got an extra little bit on one of their bones, or whatever it happens to be. That's anatomical variation. And if you always teach to this is the typical, then I really worry about our medical professions and healthcare professions, because they're then very surprised when things are not like that. And the obvious example I remember was being a test in the medical exam, and they were asked to auscultate to hear heart sounds of this particular simulated patient that came in. And this simulated patient had the heart on the other side. And the number of students that still thought that the heart was on that side and were saying, oh, yeah, no, I can hear X, Y, and Z and blah, 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 blah. And it's like, yeah, because you are thinking it's got to be there. So I must be hearing it there. But actually, no, this guy, his heart was on the other side. And he actually had everything on the other side. So he was in situs inversus. And it's like, that was a deliberate, not to trick students, but that was to say, this may occur to you. And there are hundreds of these variations. Some tiny, won't make any difference to anybody in the world, but there are some that actually may make a difference. And when you're doing an ultrasound or something else, you might see something that's intriguing. Don't dismiss it, because actually the anatomy is the anatomy and it's always right. Just might be different for that person, but it is always right.
I love that. And I remember you helping me a great deal when some of the network that I do, and I was talking to you about the scalene muscles. I know some people call them the scalenes. And, you've supposedly got your posterior, lateral, and anterior scalenes. And yet so often they feel like one spiral cord. They don't have, you know where they are, you know how to get to them without touching any blood vessels, and you know what to do with them. But the behavior when you ask somebody to move when you're working in that area, and I just remember sharing with you on one occasion, I think I might have been working on your neck at that point actually, and sharing that with you, and you said, well, actually we actually find in cadaveric specimens such variation. And you said to me that the behavior of the scalene muscles is much more like a muscle in all its variation. And that sent me down a whole rabbit hole of investigating latissimus dorsi, because I get Pilates and yoga teachers who are saying, oh no, well, we do this for latissimus dorsi. And I discovered that it's one of the greatest muscles of variation. Some people have only one slip, far from going from sort of T7, 8, 9, right the way down to the sacrum and out to the humeral head. No, it's not even like that. Sometimes it goes from the mid-spine in a very small strip to the shoulder blade and attaches to a shoulder blade. And then from the shoulder blade, the rest of its usual path. And then you're thinking, well, hang on a minute, I can't teach what I'm teaching anatomically biasedly in case the person that I'm teaching is not that shape, doesn't have that, has that variation. And I remember speaking to Thomas Findlay once at one of the International Fascia Research Congresses, and he dismissed variation. He looked at me, he overheard me talking about it, and he looked at me and he said, no, variation's only 15%. And I said, with all due respect, Dr. Findlay, you don't know which 15%. You've got absolutely no idea which 15% is different. There is no norm. The norm is the sum total of 4 cadaveric specimens that might look like that, as drawn by whoever, Jan van der Laar, who drew for Albinus God knows how many centuries ago, and so on. Do you know what I mean? It's like,
Absolutely. And look, and I
Sorry.
think if you go back to the embryo again, it gives you the answers to some of that. So, for instance, the scalene muscles, that's really, really interesting because that starts out as one muscle bulk and it's then delineated into possibly three elements, possibly even more than that.
Mm.
And the intriguing one there is the connective tissue, the fascia. That's the one that invades. That's the one that splits it and compartmentalizes it appropriately. And in some cases, it doesn't do that. And the latissimus dorsi that you're talking about, that's an intriguing muscle in itself because it's such an expansive muscle. And the view there is look, there could be a number of reasons. It could be that there wasn't enough proliferation of the muscle cells there. The muscle cells didn't reach their destinations. So maybe one of the molecular markers was switched off too early. And if you just miss something, just by that slight bit of timing, then you're never going to reach that destination again. So the attachment sites are going to be different. Did the embryo grow quite in the same sort of way at the same sort of time? And therefore, did you get the attachments all the way along the typical elements that we'll say along the vertebral column, and very thick fascia that is actually creating the attachment that's there? But again, we would then classify that, saying, well, the attachments of this muscle are X. Yeah, that should be your default position to think about, and then to say, but in this person, where is it in relationship? So you're able to obviously feel if someone's doing an MRI or a CT scan or whatever, and they're able to have the right contrast and things like that to be able to see the muscles. That's what they should be sort of looking at if that's the particular area that they need to focus on. And we're only obviously using that one as an example. But the embryo is the cause of all that. And again, it comes back to that thing of, isn't it fantastic though that most of us have all got a latissimus dorsi and virtually all the same sort of shape and design to it, but actually with those modifications, variations, and other things. And whilst it might only be 15%, 15% is always talked about in terms of overall in our body. So one element, though, make up that whole 15% because you might have a muscle that's completely absent or a structure that is completely absent. Rib one not there, clavicle not there, or whatever it happens to be. That could make up easily 15% overall in terms of variation, along with a few other bits and bobs that are there. But it is totally dependent then on that person's functionality. It's going to change the way that they are. But 15% in every bit of you would also be enough to make changes there that mean that you can't do those things that we were talking about earlier, and therefore might offer the answer to those things. It doesn't mean that you might not be able to modify what you do to get the same achievement, but you're not probably going to be using that muscle only. And let's face it, which movement of the body, this is the other thing I get upset about, which movement of the body isolates any muscle, really?
They don't, ever. Nothing. They can't, Darrell. I had a client, just to illuminate what you just said, I had a client who came to me having been classified by a physiotherapist as a deformed shoulder. He just literally had no pec major on the right, missing. Now, if you designate pec major as having a specific function, such as a deduction of the arm, he was told he couldn't play golf. And there was this hence, thus, and therefore, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, why? And he said to me, what do you mean? I said, well, why can't you play golf? And he said, well, because I've got this shot, like, I'm like looking at me baffled, like, because I don't have, you can't play golf left-handed because I've got the muscle that can do that. And I said, no. Your body plays golf. You will modify accordingly. Well, what will I do? I said, I've got absolutely no idea. But if you get a golf club and go down to the golf club with your golf clubs and your balls and play, come back and tell me how you did it. And then I can help you optimize how you do it. Because there is no how to play that game. There are optimal effects that you want to have, but no two people do the same thing to get that result. That's the big error. It's huge. And he ended up becoming a golf teacher. And we did lots of work together, working with spirals, working with the spine, working with his posture, optimizing this, that, and the other thing. And it was absolutely unique to him. And I wouldn't work like that with anybody else, because without that pec major muscle, it didn't gently and, in my opinion, lovingly pull its own clavicle away from the sternoclavicular joint. So he could get quite a bit of pain there. So we did work at the back to kind of open up the posture so that this clavicle, which wasn't being tensioned away from appropriately from the sternal notch, could move the way it needed to. And we had to make modifications to anchor a more optimal and more comfortable way of sitting, driving, sitting at a desk and playing golf. But golf coach, not just golfer, golf coach.
No, I think that's a brilliant example of the beauty of the anatomy, the way that we can adapt. But also, if you go back to somebody who says, well, variation isn't important, well, I would then say also, though, that if you've got 650 odd muscles, you've got that for a reason, because the body has been beautifully produced during evolution to know that it needs all of those different muscles to be as able as it can be to do the things that it has to. And if it says, well, I need 2 or 3 muscles to be able to do this movement effectively, then it's going to use 2 or 3 muscles. If it happens to not have one of those muscles, then it may develop those other 2 muscles more to adapt to that.
Yeah.
But if we don't enable that or allow that to happen, then it won't, because the body's not going to do things it doesn't need to do. And if you think about the caveman and the cave woman, the anatomy was different there for the different reasons of what they were doing. And the anatomy must have been very athletic for the man, because he's having to go and gather food and other things. And for the woman, a much more sedentary type approach to their anatomy, and it had to adapt to that. And then obviously during our short evolution that we've had relative over those thousands of years, we've adapted to that so that men and women are very similar in terms of the way the anatomy works and the athleticism that's there. But obviously there's differences between those two. But it does. What I would say about that, the defining feature to me is, isn't the anatomy wonderful that it is able to do those sorts of things? But we've got the anatomy we have because we've, during evolution, have shown that to be the most appropriate anatomy for us to do the things that we need to do, like other animals have done. We haven't needed those things, so we've lost them, or we've gained other things that those other animals don't have.
Well, I love that. And just to sort of finish up, I think your word appropriate is the one that sings to me, because, you know, we all talk about evolution and the survival of the fittest. And I think we've misunderstood or misinterpreted what the word fit and fittest means. I think it means the most appropriate for the environment we're in and the body that we have. And appropriate, the root of appropriate is proprio, which is Latin for one's own. And of course, fascia is now being recognized as a tissue of proprioception. So it literally is the tissue that organizes the appropriate way of us moving, if we can find that and tune into it. And I just love hearing from a professor of developmental biology and somebody who's done the most amazing journey from Kent to Sussex to the other side of the planet and back. And just thank goodness for you and your contribution. It's been brilliant. And thank you.
Well, it's been a joy speaking to you.
My pleasure. So there's lots of information. If you want to learn more from Professor Darrell Evans and work with him, then his information is going to be below this podcast. If you want to work with me and Paul and find out how to get some of this work into action, then you can also find links below to work with us. And there's loads more podcasts coming down the line. And Darrell, I just want to ask you now in front of everybody, will you come and talk to us again in the future?
Oh, yeah, of course you will.
Thank you. And thank you so much for your huge contribution to every doctor out there that trained with you. It's a joy.
Thank you for your invitation. It's been lovely to speak to you.